The thing most people assume about corn is wrong. Corn is not just corn on the cob, popcorn, corn chips, or yellow vegetable sitting beside a steak. In the American food system, corn is closer to an industrial raw material. It gets cracked apart, refined, fermented, sweetened, dried, blended, and rebuilt into thousands of products that do not look like corn at all. That is the reversal. Corn did not just become one food among many. Corn became one of the hidden ingredients holding the grocery store together. Here is the simplest way to understand it. The corn most Americans meet at the grocery store is usually not sweet corn. Sweet corn is the kind people boil, grill, butter, and eat off the cob. That is the visible corn. That is the corn that most people recognize. The corn that runs through the food system is mostly field corn. It is harder, starchier, less sweet, and grown at a scale that makes it useful for processing. It is not designed mainly to be eaten whole. It is designed economically and physically to be taken completely apart. The corn kernel looks simple from the outside, but inside is a small package of starch, oil, protein, fiber, and germ. Industrial processing turns those parts into ingredients. Wet milling separates the kernel into its components. Dry milling grinds it into meals, grits, flours, and cereal ingredients. And fermentation turns corn sugars into alcohols and many other products. Animal agriculture turns corn into meat, milk, eggs, and poultry. That is the mechanism. Corn disappears because the kernel stops being treated as a kernel. It becomes a platform. Once the starch is separated, it can become corn syrup, glucose syrup, dextrose, maltodextrin, food starch, modified starch, or high fructose corn syrup. Once the oil is pulled out, it can become corn oil. Once the protein and fiber streams move through the system, they can become feed ingredients. And once corn sugar enters fermentation, it can become ethanol or other industrial products. That is how corn moves from the field into places where nobody would call it corn. It thickens salad dressings, it sweetens soda, it helps texture yogurt, it helps bind processed meat, it helps cereal hold its shape. And it shows up in baked goods, sauces, frozen meals, candy, condiments, snack foods, beverages, and packing adjacent materials. It also sits behind the meat case because a large share of domestic corn still moves through livestock feed. The USDA says corn accounts for more than 95% of US feed grain production and use. That one number explains why corn is not just a crop. It is a base layer under American animal agriculture, processed foods, sweeteners, starches, ethanol, and industrial ingredients. The key actors are not only farmers. Farmers grow the crop, but the invisibility happens after harvest. It happens inside the processors, refiners, grain handlers, ethanol plants, feed mills, and other food manufacturers that turn corn into thousands of usable forms. The Corn Refiners Association lists member company including ADM, Cargill, Grain Processing Corporation, Ingredion, Primient, Roquette America, and Tate and Lyle Americas. These companies do not just buy corn and resell it. They separate it, convert it, standardize it, and sell it as ingredient streams. That matters because food companies do not simply need corn. They need dependable sweetness, dependable viscosity, dependable texture, shelf life, fermentation behavior, and dependable cost. High fructose corn syrup is a good example, but it is not the whole story. FDA describes the common forms as roughly 42% or 55% fructose. So HFCS 42 appears in processed foods, cereals, baked goods, and some beverages. HFCS 55 is used mainly in soft drinks. That detail matters because the product is not random sweetness. It is engineered functionally. The difference between 42 and 55 is a difference between ingredient behavior, product category, and its actual manufacturing needs. The same is true for starch. Corn starch can be modified so it behaves differently under heat, acid, freezing, mixing, or storage. A frozen meal, a pudding cup, a sauce, and a snack coating do not need the same textures. Corn processing gives manufacturers a complete toolbox. This is where that 4,000 comes from. But it has to be said carefully. The strongest version is not that one American literally eats 4,000 separate corn forms every day. The stronger claim is that a grocery store can carry thousands of products containing corn-derived ingredients or connected to corn through feeds, sweeteners, starches, oils, fermentation, and just processing. That is still a larger claim than most people expect. Picture someone walking through a Kroger in Columbus, Ohio. They are not trying to buy corn. They pick up sandwich bread, deli meat, yogurt, salad dressing, soda, cereal, frozen pizza, chicken nuggets, toothpaste, and diapers. On the surface, that cart looks diverse. Different aisles, different brands, different categories, completely different decisions. But underneath, corn keeps appearing. It appears as a sweetener. It appears as a starch. It appears as an oil. It appears as a feed input behind meat, eggs, and dairy. It appears as a texture tool. It appears as a fermentation source. And it appears in the supply chain before the shopper ever reads the label. That is the human level version of the system. A person can avoid buying corn and still move through a grocery store built around corn. The counterintuitive detail is that corn's power is not just cheap calories. That is too simple. Corn became embedded because it solves manufacturing problems. It makes products sweeter, thicker, smoother, cheaper, more stable, easier to ship, easier to store, and easier to reproduce at scale. A food company does not want every batch to behave differently. It wants the same sauce, the same soda, the same snack, the same bun, and the same mouthfeel every time. And corn can make that possible. That is why removing corn from the food system would not mean pulling one ingredient from an aisle. It would mean reformulating the architect of the grocery store. And this matters because it shows how modern food abundance actually works. The grocery store looks like variety, but underneath that variety sits a narrow set of crops, processors, ingredient systems, and supply chains. Corn is one of the load-bearing ones. It supports animal protein, processed foods, starches, oils, fermentation, and shelf stability. That does not make corn good or bad by itself. It makes corn structural. And once a crop becomes structural, the question changes. We stop asking whether Americans eat corn or start asking how much of the food system has been quietly rebuilt around it. The grocery store does not just sell corn. In thousands of ways, the grocery store actually depends on corn.